Well, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Transformation Talks. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I'm the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, where our mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through the TRHC framework, which includes narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. Transformation Talks, which has been in the past Transformation Tuesday, is our way to communicate directly to community members about the effects of race and racism on very specific topics in our community, and to explore different ways in which we can address those issues and inequities. I'm really excited today because I have an old colleague I've seen in a long time, Dr. Barbara Minsker, who is the Bobby B. Lyle Professor of Leadership and Global Entrepreneurship and Senior Fellow of the Hunt Institute for Engineering and Humanity and Civil and Environmental Engineering at Southern Methodist University. I'm not even going to start to read all of the amazing educational background and research areas that Dr. Barbara Minsker has accomplished. But we are here very specifically to talk about this exciting project that has actually occurred over a number of years, that has culminated in a report that has got our city and city council very specifically buzzing about what they can do about infrastructure equity. So I'm excited to see Dr. Barbara Minsker. Welcome to Transformation Talks. How are you?
Thank you, Jerry. I'm doing great.
Awesome. So just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the study, and I look forward to hearing and learning from you.
Yeah, so as Jerry said, I'm a professor at SMU, and I've been working on this topic for 5 years now. I moved to SMU, and this was one of the first topics that I started based on a lot of conversations, including with Jerry back then, and a tour of Dallas that was given by Habitat for Humanity of low-income neighborhoods, and telling us the stories of the problems they had in trying to put up more affordable housing and how the infrastructure kept getting in the way. And I started thinking about this and said, I think there's something going on here and we're going to study it. So that's how it all started. Really want to thank Jerry for being part of the first group that looked at this. My phone is beeping at me. Go away. We had a workshop. It was a few days workshop called a Think, Play, Hack. And Jerry came along and helped us figure out what is an infrastructure desert. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today, because this is the first time that infrastructure deserts have been coined and we've started to understand what they are. Food deserts have been around for a while, if you've heard of them. They're low-income areas with very little access to fresh foods relative to higher income areas. So with that, should I go ahead and share my screen, Jared?
You should.
All right. So I'm going to start out with the news story that Jerry referred to. Make this full screen. Can everybody see it? Can you see it now, shared?
I see it. It looks good.
All right, excellent. I'm going to start it up. Let me know if you can't hear it.
A report from Southern Methodist University documents what some people already knew. Many Dallas neighborhoods are severely lacking in the basics, things like streets, sidewalks, and access to medical care. Ken Kaltoff has the story.
A neighborhood around Lenway and South Harwood is what the SMU report grades as an infrastructure desert, showing years of neglect. Freeways came through a generation ago without sound walls to protect people from noise.
Imagine having to listen to that all day. There's huge health effects from that.
It has bad sidewalks not far from a school and a church that's hard to walk to. The SMU study looked at 12 features of neighborhood infrastructure, things like streets, and sidewalks using city data and aerial maps. The data is plotted on maps to show areas lacking internet access or medical care. Most are in southern Dallas.
This is sort of showing you with data what we've all known anecdotally, folks like me who grew up south of I-30.
But the SMU research went further.
We've looked at 3 other cities, New York, LA, and Chicago, and Dallas has the worst infrastructure of all of them and the most inequity in terms of low income versus high income.
It's more evidence for the new priority Dallas leaders have placed on equity in future spending.
We've got to overinvest in those areas that have historically been underinvested in. Once we do that, we'll begin to bring about the equality.
It's not going to be something that we can solve overnight either because the dollar amounts are so significant. But what we're going to have is a sustained effort.
It may take future generations to catch up with the neglect, but that is the goal. City leaders say a stronger South Side would make the entire city stronger. In Dallas, Ken Kaltoff, NBC5.
Also tonight, Dallas.
Okay, so that gives you a little introduction and hearing a little bit from the mayor and a city council member about their thoughts on these findings. And with that, I will go ahead and give you an introduction. First, I want to acknowledge my PhD student, John Lee, who is graduating on Saturday and has spent the last 5 years working on this topic and generating the results that I'm going to show you today.
Very exciting. He's a really sharp student.
He is, very much so. So what we're talking about here in terms of infrastructure is what we're calling neighborhood infrastructure, which means it's the small scale infrastructure that serves people in their neighborhoods for whatever their needs are. So it can be anything from public transit, bus stops, train stations, to the streets and crosswalks and sidewalks, to trails for walking or biking that we might access. And also medical facilities or places that we might buy fresh foods like farmers markets or grocery stores. And neighborhood infrastructure supports people's needs, and it makes a big difference in quality of life. It has an impact on health, and there's social justice issues associated with it, which is what the focus of what we're doing. And this cartoon illustrates equality versus equity. And really, we don't have either here. Equality being everybody gets the same thing, equity being everybody's needs get met. And we've primarily been looking at equality in this study, but we want to move more towards equity, understanding better what needs people have in terms of the infrastructure that serves them. So if we have infrastructure inequity, meaning that the infrastructure doesn't meet people's needs, then we can see a lot less resilience, both from individuals as well as the community as a whole, when problems happen, whether it's a pandemic that comes through or a tornado like we saw a few years ago, or that big winter storm that came through. Certain areas of town were hit much harder than others. And part of that is affected by infrastructure problems like the water and energy issues that we saw during the winter storm. And then quality of life is also affected. So the way we define infrastructure deserts is that they're low-income areas, and those areas we have to define in terms of census block groups, which are how the census keeps track of the statistics on people's income and their socioeconomic status. Is census block groups is the smallest group at which those statistics are reported. So it's those low-income areas with a higher risk of having highly deficient infrastructure. And we'll define what we mean by highly deficient as we go through, but basically, whether it's poor sidewalks, bad internet, not being able to access different services and facilities. And we'll bring in what's the role of race and ethnicity. So going beyond income to say, well, is there equity in terms of different neighborhoods having different predominant race and ethnicity, and also bringing a historical perspective, taking a look at some of the discriminatory laws that were in the past, and also when neighborhoods were built. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So we created a framework that assesses 12 different types of infrastructure right now, although it could be used for more as well. Looks at the condition of the infrastructure and whether it exists, how equitable is the infrastructure, and does some statistical modeling to see what's the relative risk for people in terms of having worse infrastructure. That all feeds into an automated framework that allows us to do multiple cities pretty easily and also to update with new data. So the steps of the framework for assessing the infrastructure are first identifying where do we have deficiencies in the infrastructure, then identifying where the infrastructure deserts exist, and then looking at those statistics. So this just gives you a little example. It's a little bit busy slide, but can you see the pointer? Jared, can you see my pointer moving around?
I sure can.
Okay, great. So when we get down to the street level of looking at a particular neighborhood, we might be looking at a sidewalk here. And for that sidewalk, we know the condition. This is city data. For the red here would be the sidewalk is either doesn't exist or in its bad condition and it's not passable. And we might find in this particular neighborhood that 60% of those sidewalks are substandard, meaning either they don't exist or they're not in good condition. And so we would say that this neighborhood is deficient, and we have this deficiency indicator called theta. So anything over 50% of the neighborhood having bad infrastructure, we say, yep, that neighborhood is deficient. And we do the same kind of thing for access types of infrastructure like trails. We'll look at every single individual home and see which ones do not have access to trails within a 10-minute walk is what the criteria say. And if the neighborhood only has 30% of the households that don't have access to trails, then they would not be considered substandard, would have to be over 50%. And then we take those statistics and we take a look at, well, how do these different neighborhoods stack up relative to other ones? And we put those in order based on excellent condition to highly deficient condition. And so the very worst 10% of neighborhoods in terms of the condition of the infrastructure are called highly deficient. And we take that category, and when they are low income as well, then those are our infrastructure deserts. So the very worst infrastructure condition, worst 10% in the city, and low income as well. In Dallas, we looked at 12 different kinds of infrastructure. They're all listed here. Most of the data are available publicly. There is one type of data, crosswalks, that wasn't available, and we actually used aerial images and machine learning to find that. And noise walls, we actually, we had a student who drove through on the highways and labeled Google Street View images to see whether they had noise walls in place or not. And then these are all the different criteria that were used for each of the 12 types. And Jerry, I will give you my slides afterwards and you can share this with people because I'm not going to go through all these details now.
Sounds good.
But this way, at least it's available. And this is the other 6 types of infrastructure. And this column here shows you, did we measure it at the household level or the street segment level? In the case of internet, it was actually only at the census tract that data were available. So here's our infrastructure deserts. As you can see, would expect, since they are low income areas, they are primarily in southern parts of Dallas below I-30, a few above. And they also are the ones that have highly deficient infrastructure. In terms of our 12 types of infrastructure, the very worst are tree canopy. These are having street trees along the edge of the street that provide shade to keep the street cooler so that people will be more comfortable when they go outside of their homes or try to walk to public transit. Sidewalks are also the very worst. So if you look at the edge here, 100% of infrastructure deserts have these problems: inadequate street trees, sidewalk problems, and no noise walls in the areas that are right next to highways. Within, I think it's 400 feet of a highway, you're supposed to have some kind of barrier to cut down on the noise because it has bad health problems. Medical services, having medical services nearby is the next one. And then we drop down to trail access and food access. If we compare that to all the other neighborhoods, we see very similar on tree canopy being the worst. Sidewalks are a little bit better in some of the other neighborhoods, as well as noise walls, far fewer noise wall issues in those other areas. And trails and medical services also pop up to the top in the other areas. We did another side study with a master's student that looked at how do these infrastructure problems connect with accidents that happen between cars and pedestrians or bicyclists. And this shows you an example of an intersection that has a very high rate of crashes. This is North Haskell Street and Gaston Avenue, which is not far from where I live. I drive past this all the time, going to my doctors at Baylor, which are just down the street from here. So this has very high level of crashes. It has bad infrastructure. And part of the reason it has so many crashes is because you can't see the bus stop over here on the left. So there's a lot of pedestrian traffic coming in on the bus and going to these different services. But as you can see, this street is not built for people. It's built for cars. And you have a lot of cars coming through. So I think this particular intersection, if I remember, it had 8 pedestrian and bicycle crashes with vehicles during the 2-year period that we studied. So we took a look at this. These are correlations. They're not causation necessarily, but we see that areas with deficiencies in crosswalk, meaning that there are either the crosswalks aren't there or they're not visible, that they were 15% higher rate of crashes at those intersections. In low income areas, there are 34% more of these accidents than in high income areas. And areas with sidewalk problems are 86% more likely to have these sorts of crashes. And highly deficient intersections in terms of infrastructure as a whole are 3 times more likely to have crashes. So we've got some potentially serious safety issues at some of these areas that need to be looked at. Okay, so coming back to our other results then, we start to look at gaps in different areas, both by income and by race and ethnicity. And this is where you'll start to see the race and ethnicity data. So this graph shows you how many of those 12 kinds of infrastructure are deficient in each neighborhood, and how sort of graphing the percentage of neighborhoods that have those levels of infrastructure deficiency. So we're separating these by low income in red, middle income in yellow, and high income in blue. And the top then would be the most common level of deficiency, which for low income would be 6 types of deficient infrastructure. And for high income would be 5 types. And so we see this gap between the red one is shifted out to the right compared to the middle and the high income, which means that the low income neighborhoods are more likely to have these deficiencies with their infrastructure. When we break this out by race and ethnicity, we see that the predominantly Black neighborhoods in green have more neighborhoods that have infrastructure deficiencies, and the predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods and the predominantly Black neighborhoods are both shifted to the right as well. meaning that they have worse infrastructure condition compared to the predominantly white or the neighborhoods that have no predominant race or ethnicity. So we see that same gap happening here. Then this is the statistical modeling where we looked at the relative risk of one kind of neighborhood relative to another. So in this graph, it's low income versus high income neighborhoods and how many infrastructure types. So your infrastructure is getting worse as you go to the right. How many deficient types are there of the 12? And then because it's the statistical model has a confidence interval, a 95% confidence interval. So we have a range that says low income neighborhoods are 2 to 4 times more likely to have bad infrastructure than high income neighborhoods. So very significant differences. And we define highly deficient as more than 8 or more kinds of deficient infrastructure of the 12. When we go to race and ethnicity, we got a little problem with our animation, but this is the graph for the race ethnicity looking at predominantly Black neighborhoods. So in that highly deficient category, in the neighborhoods with the worst infrastructure, we see a range of 2 to 5 times more likely to have the worst infrastructure. So this is more severe amongst predominantly Black versus neighborhoods with no predominant race or ethnicity, which is this line here is the baseline. So this is even worse than the income disparities that we saw on the last slide. For predominantly Hispanic, we see inequities as well, but smaller, from 1.5 to 3 times more likely to have bad infrastructure. And then in the predominantly white neighborhoods, we see that they're actually less likely to have bad infrastructure than the neighborhoods with no predominant race or ethnicity. And then this is the results slide that surprised me the most. This is a little bit complicated, so hang in there with me. The x-axis shows the income from low to high. The y-axis shows level of deficiency. So not deficient infrastructure would be at the bottom, highly deficient infrastructure is at the top. So on the left side, then we see low income and highly deficient. And we've got the breakdown by race and ethnicity again in the same colors. So the green are predominantly Black and the orange are predominantly Hispanic. So at low income, we see very large discrepancies between the infrastructure condition being deficient versus not deficient. Very large gap here between these two lines of predominantly white versus the other race and ethnicities. The piece that surprised me is when we go to high income, we still see that gap. It's smaller, but it's still there. So even in the highest income neighborhoods, we see equity issues between predominantly Black and predominantly white neighborhoods. So, Jerry, do you have any questions rolling in yet? Do you want to take a little break?
I have so
here?
many questions and so many thoughts. What did you do?
So why don't we take a little break here? Because
Yeah.
I've talked a lot, and then I'll show you some of the other results.
That sounds good, because I have tons of questions.
Okay. I'll bring you back.
Yeah, let me start by saying, thank you for sharing that. And you shared the story in the beginning. So I really want to start with that question. A lot of people have complained that SMU, for instance, and other universities, private universities like SMU, are not open to the public. So I just want to commend you for, number one, just opening up, your students to the community, and for, thinking about how your students can be helped by community members such as myself with the work that you all were doing, which is engineering, which is usually thought of as a very universally non-biased, right? All about math and algorithms kind of field of study. But you saw some of these things happening earlier when you all were defining, you were looking for the definition of infrastructure equity. Can you tell me first about how this project came to be and what was the impetus behind it?
Yeah, so I talked about the tour that I took of Habitat for
That's right.
Humanity, and they were putting in a whole neighborhood at the time. And when they went to the city to see, to get approval for the building permits, they were told that they had to install all the water and wastewater pipes. They had to put in the streets and the sidewalks. They had to do all of that infrastructure in addition to building the homes that they wanted to build. So I hear this from many developers who are trying to do affordable housing. It's the same story where the infrastructure is so bad in certain areas that they don't even try those areas. They know that they just need to avoid them because the infrastructure is too expensive to make the project viable. So that was a big driver. And I think there was one developer who came to that workshop that you came to. It was Doric Earl, I think.
Yes, Doric Earl, yes.
Yeah. And then I also heard stories from other researchers, for example, saying that there's a DART station that sits on top of a septic tank because it's not connected to the wastewater system of the city.
Wow.
Which really surprised me to hear that, although I haven't confirmed that with DART. So it could just be a rumor. So this was the story that got us going, but it took us a long time just to figure out what to do, how to do it, how to define even neighborhood infrastructure has not really been defined by anybody. And there was a class that I had where I just sent the students out and we chose 2 neighborhoods that were low income and talked to Habitat for Humanity and a few other people when we chose those. Mm-hmm. And then we took 2 high income neighborhoods and we compared them. And I sent the students to those neighborhoods and said, okay, just observe and see what you see differently in these neighborhoods and just write that down. And they came back and they said, well, you know it when you see it. I mean, there's obviously infrastructure deserts. And they came back with some characteristics that they were observing. And then we started to look into and get the data for each of those characteristics and others that we came up with in talking to other people. So that's how it gradually grew. But it's why between that and getting our hands on the data, why it took 5 years for my student to finally graduate.
Wow. So, you mentioned, finding a lot of this data by income, and I'm sure there's tons of census tract data out there about income. But when you started to see some of the disparities when it comes to race, what were your first impressions, particularly as an engineer? A lot of the community members I've talked to about this story said that race is probably not the best way to look at this as an engineering problem, but you started to see some of these similar correlations between race and income. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wasn't surprised to see that pattern was there just because of the historical inequity, racism, bias that's happened, whatever you want to call it. But I was surprised to see the extent of it and how it pervades even in higher income neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And this is something, what I really want to do in the next phase of this research is to actually get on the ground in these neighborhoods and talk to people and understand how is this affecting their lives and what things are important to them in terms of addressing infrastructure problems, because I'll talk about that at the end. We've assumed that every neighborhood should have the same type of infrastructure, but that very well might not be true. So anyway, yeah, I was very disturbed, obviously, to see those inequities playing out. You would think that we could do better today than what we're seeing.
That's really important, and I'm excited about that next phase because that's definitely going to bring some community conversations around infrastructure that I don't think have happened really about connecting the report to their real life issues, and I'm sure you're going to find some of those septic tank, real life examples of that. My last question before I want you to continue with the presentation is, you talked, you had three different ways of comparing some of the data by race. You used, Black residents, Hispanic, Latino residents, and white residents. When accounting for all of the, the different infrastructure points, I think there were 12 in the report. What did you see that really besides obviously the inequity, that you thought was an outlier from all of the rest? And why did you use just those three racial and ethnic descriptors?
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understood the first part of the question.
Yeah,
outliers in terms of
like outliers in terms of this is interesting, maybe I need to look into this a little bit more, or this is kind of par for the course, or something that really stuck out, besides what you just mentioned, as a term of how infrastructure is really playing into this gap. Because when I saw that, that gap, it mirrored some of the racial wealth gap work that, The Color of Law, the book that you mentioned, Richard Rothstein talks about, that was actually, put in by housing policy and not even infrastructure policy, right? So, there's anecdotal evidence about infrastructure inequity. For instance, the city of Dallas didn't provide infrastructure to a Black community that was a freedmen's town called Little Egypt. And the whole community moved in the 1960s. And then all of a sudden, infrastructure was put into the community, including plumbing, running water, electricity. And now they built, developments and $500,000 homes on it. But the example that, some of the things that we see in infrastructure won't play out in housing policy. So, just some outliers from that.
Well, I guess one of the things we saw was that in terms of the access types of infrastructure, which is everything from public transit to medical services to food, those are dependent on, how far away are people from that particular service. And we saw some newer neighborhoods that had worse access than other areas, and some higher income areas that had worse public transit than others. So that was the one area, was public transit, where when we mapped it out by race and ethnicity, we saw that the predominantly Black neighborhoods had better public transit than the other types of neighborhoods did. So there is more service in terms of public transit for lower income people, as well as predominantly Black neighborhoods. But what that doesn't say is, yes, there's a stop nearby, but does it take you where you need to go in a reasonable amount of time? That's a whole separate question. And my understanding is that there's some pretty serious issues there in terms of people being able to get where they need to go in a reasonable amount of time. The whole transit system's now been restructured and stops have been moved. And our study, the data were from before those changes were made. But I thought that was kind of one outlier where we were scratching our heads. Like, some of the high income neighborhoods also have worse sidewalks because they don't have sidewalks. And I think at the time, these were older neighborhoods. People figured they had cars, what did they need sidewalks for?
Yeah.
So we still see that in some of these higher income areas where people didn't think they were going to want to walk around their neighborhood. They would just drive. And so the thought was nobody would care about it. But in today's era where we realize people need to get out and exercise, the importance of sidewalks is much more than it was in the past.
For that stat, I've seen this number out here, and I want to confirm with you, the expert now, that it's true that 90% of Dallas is sidewalk deficient. Is that a true number?
Well, we can go back to that graph if you like. Hang on, I just lost you. Here we go, share screen again. So sidewalks are the second bar down, and the percentage of neighborhoods that have deficient infrastructure are here. So yeah, it's just over 90% of the neighborhoods. But remember, the way that we were doing this is a deficient neighborhood means that more than 50% of that neighborhood has bad sidewalks.
Bad or no sidewalks, right?
Right, right. So it doesn't mean that, so 90% of the neighborhoods have more than 50% of the neighborhood with non-existent or impassable sidewalks, which is a little different than saying 90% of the sidewalks as a whole. And I haven't done the translation to see that, but people have looked at that and said, yeah, it's about 90%. So it's a very bad situation on sidewalks. And when the city asked me, you know, what 3 things would you do if you could wave a wand and fix? I said, first thing, invest in sidewalks, because it's just crazy the way that our sidewalks are so bad.
No, that's true. And as a person who bikes and also uses sidewalks all the time, you know, I know how dangerous it is to not have that infrastructure. So yes, Dr. Metzger, please continue with the presentation.
Okay. So now we're going to start to look at some of the historical issues. So these are all our census block groups citywide and their infrastructure deficiency levels. So the dark areas would be the highly deficient, and among those, the low income ones would be the infrastructure deserts. But these are all the highly deficient neighborhoods. And again, you can see that concentration in Southern Dallas of highly deficient areas, regardless of income. And so if we pull out from all these different neighborhoods, which were around when the Homeowner Loan Corporation had their discriminatory housing policy, where they graded neighborhoods from best to category A to category D hazardous, primarily based on race. And so the predominantly Black neighborhoods were categorized as D, and the predominantly white neighborhoods were categorized as A. And the size of the mortgage that people could get was dependent on this rating. So people living in hazardous areas were not eligible for mortgages at all. So when we start to look at those neighborhoods and see, well, what's going on with them today in terms of their infrastructure, do we still see that legacy from these redlining and discriminatory policies? So the redlined areas are the ones in red in category D, if you hear that term. So this graph is a little bit complicated. Let me just walk you through it. So at the bottom, we have our HOLC grades from best on the left to hazardous on the right. That's the redlined areas on the right. On the y-axis is the overall infrastructure deficiency in terms of how many bad types of infrastructure do these neighborhoods have. This is called a box whisker diagram. So the middle of this line across is the median of all the neighborhoods.
Mm,
So it's not the same as the average, but you can think of it that way. So a
yeah.
typical neighborhood is in the middle. The top of the box is the very worst infrastructure. The bottom is the very best. So as we go from grade A to grade D for those areas that were around in the city when they were doing this grading, we see that the infrastructure deficiencies are worse today in areas that had lower grades. And so D has that typical neighborhood is higher. We also see the very worst neighborhood in terms of infrastructure condition is highest for these both C and D. Now we take it a step further in complexity and break it down by race and ethnicity. And actually, I forgot, Jerry, you asked me the question of why we use these three categories.
That's right.
We looked at a larger set of race and ethnicity. These were the only ones that came out to be predominantly one type or another. So that means more than 50% of the neighborhood was white, in the case of predominantly white. Other types of race and ethnicity, we didn't see more than 50% in any
Okay.
neighborhood. So that's how that was chosen.
That makes sense.
So when we start to look at the A's, we see that still today, the predominantly white, they are still predominantly white in those A categories. And they have better infrastructure than the C and the D categories. So we see also this trend. So when we look at the neighborhoods that were categorized C when this program was around, some of those are now predominantly white neighborhoods. Their infrastructure's gotten better. And it's better than the neighborhoods that have stayed predominantly Black. Some of that might be because of redevelopment. Some of these are in the central city area, and they may have shifted from being predominantly Black at that time. Now some of them are predominantly white, and their infrastructure condition got better when they became predominantly white. So we see this legacy of racism and bias, based on ethnicity for the Hispanic groups as well, is still here today. Does this graph make sense? Do you need me to explain it anymore, Jerry?
No, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay. So then this last chart, instead of HOLC grades, now we looked at neighborhood age. And on the top, we've got different decades of when the neighborhood was built in terms of the average date that it was built. And again, we've got that same box and whiskers in terms of the infrastructure condition of those neighborhoods. And these red arrows on the bottom show you the neighborhoods that have the worst infrastructure condition. And it's the ones that were built from the 1940s to the 1960s that have the typical neighborhood lines are higher for those, but also the 1980s. For some reason, it got better more recently in most decades, but the 1980s was a bad decade, apparently, for building neighborhoods. And the very highest, worst, most deficient neighborhoods are the ones built in the 50s, followed by the 40s, but some in 2000s that were pretty bad as well. Then we can take those same data and break them down by race and ethnicity by decade. And we see those years when the redlining was predominantly happening. There's neighborhoods built from the 1930s to the 1950s. We can see that trend upward where the infrastructure is getting worse in those predominantly Black neighborhoods. So these are predominantly Black today, but they still have worse infrastructure, these neighborhoods that were built in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s somewhat. We see that same trend, though, in the 2000s, where the predominantly Black neighborhoods built in the 2000s and the predominantly Hispanic are worse than the predominantly white in terms of infrastructure condition. So even today, we are not doing so well in terms of equity by race and ethnicity. Any questions about this one?
So
I
many
promise this is
questions.
the last super complicated graph.
Right. My question for this is, what are the implications of the preponderance of lack of infrastructure by race when inequities are so baked into systems? Because now you're not just talking about infrastructure as a kind of a separate thing from the way people live. Like, what are the implications on people's livelihoods? Like the health, the the way that people can actually thrive in a community when these things are happening.
Health is one of the biggest impacts. So if you walk outside and you've got no decent sidewalk to be able to walk on, you've got no park nearby, you have no trail to walk on. Parks are also included in the study. Where are you going to get out and get exercise?
Mhm.
How are you going to stay safe while you're walking your child to school or walking to church? If you are walking out in the middle of the street, and I have seen, a person on a pretty major road riding in a wheelchair in the traffic lane with a big, one of those safety vests attached to the back of the wheelchair and a flag to try and, notify the drivers that, hey, there's a wheelchair on the street here. But there have been accidents with people in wheelchairs because they can't drive. They can't ride their wheelchairs safely on the sidewalk. Even in my neighborhood that is more wealthy, I see, my neighbor, a new mother, pushing her stroller out in the middle of the street because she can't push it down the sidewalk. So that's part of it. Also, inadequate noise walls with those highways right close to people's homes, that can cause all kinds of health problems. Not having enough shade, the heat has a big impact on people. It also increases crime. When people are hotter, they're grumpier, and there's more crime, turns out. And so there's more heat stroke, more, people who say, well, it's too hot to even walk to the bus stop, so I can't go out at all if I don't have a car.
You also mentioned,
go ahead.
You also mentioned that Dallas, as compared to the 3 other cities that you mentioned, has the worst infrastructure. What does that mean for a city who wants to be a world-class city and proposes itself to, have 2 airports, large sports teams and restaurants and all this, but the infrastructure is inadequate for, a lot of the things in the future to take place, particularly the preponderance of cars on the road and lack of walking and pedestrian, public transportation infrastructure.
Yeah, well, the next section of the talk is the 4-city comparison. So
let's look at that.
Perfect lead in.
Okay.
So here's our 4-city comparison. We looked at Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, and Dallas. And we were only able to look at 10 of the 12 infrastructure types because we couldn't get the data for all 12. And when we compare, these are the histograms of the percentage of block groups. So in Dallas, we see the most common level of deficient infrastructure is 6 of the 10 types. In Chicago, the most common is 2. So the graph is shifted to the left for Chicago, which means their overall infrastructure is not as bad as ours on average. For New York City, they've got the best infrastructure. It's the most shifted to the left. So of these 4 cities, we have the very worst of all of them. When we start to break that down by income, we see the same shift that I talked about in the city of Dallas. We see a similar shift to the right for the low-income neighborhoods for Chicago, at least at the lower levels of infrastructure deficiencies, but more similar at the higher levels. We don't see that clear trend in New York City or Los Angeles. And in fact, in Los Angeles, so we see that gap due to income in those 2 cities. In LA, we actually see that the high income areas have worse infrastructure at these high numbers. And so we think that has to do with access, that there are very wealthy areas of Los Angeles that are very isolated and don't have public transit or other services nearby because people just drive cars in Los Angeles and they probably don't care about that. So a little different culture in Los Angeles than we see in other places. When we break this down by race and ethnicity, we see that gap again that I showed you in Dallas also occurs in Chicago, where the predominantly Black and predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods have worse infrastructure. We don't see that in New York City, and we don't see it in Los Angeles. So this is very interesting to try and figure out, well, why don't they have the same kinds of inequities in New York and Los Angeles that we have in Chicago and Dallas? And we have a hypothesis. I don't know for sure if this is it, but if we take a look at, oh, wait, I got one more slide to show you. This is the complicated one. Then I'll show you the hypothesis. So this is the relative risk of having highly deficient infrastructure for those 4 cities. And the little cubes show you, so here's that green color again for the predominantly Black neighborhoods. The cube is for average income of across predominantly Black neighborhoods. How bad is their infrastructure? And so when it's higher up here, it means they've got worse infrastructure. So in LA, we see the same pattern, but it's not as spread out. In New York, in Dallas, we see that pattern, but actually Chicago does worse in terms of that average income neighborhood, and predominantly Black is that much worse than the no predominant race or ethnicity neighborhoods. We can add to that. Yeah, so here's some nice arrows showing you those trends of the infrastructure getting better as we move from predominantly Black to predominantly Hispanic to no predominant. Now we bring in income. This is where this graph gets more complicated still, and we'll see if this is helpful or not. But the red arrows show you as the income drops from average, is the infrastructure getting worse or is it getting better? In Los Angeles, it's getting worse. In New York City, it's actually getting better as income drops from the average. In Dallas, we've already seen it gets worse. And Chicago is a little bit split on this front. As income gets higher, which are the blue arrows, when we go to higher income neighborhoods, we see in Los Angeles that the infrastructure gets better at higher income, and pretty much across the other cities except New York, where the infrastructure gets worse as we go to higher income areas. So when we combine the race ethnicity with income, we get more mixed results. And we have to dive in deeper in these cities to really understand what's going on with these trends. But our hypothesis, when we start to map out where these predominantly white, Hispanic, and Black neighborhoods are versus no predominant race, in colors, here's Dallas over here on the right. You can see clear lines between the areas of, that are predominantly one area versus another. It's very segregated even today. When we go to Chicago, we see that similar clear segregation by race and ethnicity still existing today. When we look at New York, it's much more homogenous. The lines are blurred. Yeah, there's still some green patches. There's still some blue patches, but it's more mixed. It's not as segregated in New York. In Los Angeles, we see somewhere in between, but not as clear boundaries between race and ethnicity as we see in Chicago and Dallas. We think this might be partly because the cost of living has been higher in Los Angeles and New York for a long time. So there's probably been more redevelopment in those lower income areas, neighborhoods becoming less stratified. As more people are moving in, there's probably more gentrification happening because of those higher cost housing. So that may be why we're seeing less infrastructure issues in these cities where there's been more redevelopment and drop in racial segregation.
I'm also
That's our
interested in,
hypothesis, but we have to look at other cities to know for sure.
I'm also interested because I've lived in Chicago and New York. They both have a segregated South and West sides where most of the people of color live. But they also had a white flight. Many of those Black and brown neighborhoods were formerly white neighborhoods that were built post World War I, post World War II. And some of the infrastructure is still there that was built during that time when those white families moved north, because both of these cities kind of developed along those lines. They also got new infrastructure because they got new federally funded, for the most part, planned communities. So I'm interested in how infrastructure and housing, particularly when it comes to white flight from the neighborhoods that they used to live in, goes along those lines. So that's really interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that white flight would have happened in what, like 70s?
Well, some of the white flight happened as Black communities were moving into, like, for instance, Dallas. Started in the early 50s.
Right.
The bombing campaign.
The bombings, yeah.
Started from 1929 and 1951 in Dallas, and folks started to move out as early as the 50s. So I'm interested in, just the movement of families in cities.
Yeah. So that historical piece, we're looking at today's infrastructure, right? And then it's hard to go back and see what the condition of the infrastructure was at the time. But when we had that white flight, if it was primarily in the 50s and 60s when that happened, that's a long time ago. So that infrastructure, if it wasn't maintained since then, it's probably in bad shape at this point.
Yeah, because the 70s white flight that you talked about was mostly about schooling,
Right.
So yeah, I'm interested in those too. So
so even the 70s would have been 50 years ago. So infrastructure needs more consistent. So the maintenance is often the issue, where the maintenance has just been flagging.
I was just having this conversation too about that. Folks who are giving money to cities for even not just city infrastructure, but city humanities, such as the Carnegie Foundation, when they gave money to cities in the South for libraries, they would not give the funding for the library unless the city would commit money to actual maintenance of the property. And so I'm really interested in, how maintenance, because that's a huge issue in Dallas. We build things, but we don't maintain the structures that we build. And obviously, if we're not maintaining the structure, we're definitely not doing the infrastructure work to access the structure. So,
yeah, there's an interesting story there with sidewalks, because the homeowner or property owner is actually required to maintain the sidewalks in front of their home. So if it's an apartment complex, the owner of the apartment has to maintain the sidewalk. If it's a single family home, then they're in charge of that sidewalk. So in Southern Dallas, there's a lot of single family homes that people who are low income live in. And the city says, well, it's your sidewalk, you have to maintain it. And they will cover up to 50% of the cost of repairing the sidewalk. But if you're working 3 jobs and you can't even put food on the table, how are you going to think about what your sidewalk looks like in front of your house? And even if you do fix your sidewalk, if your neighbors don't fix their sidewalk, it's a useless sidewalk. It doesn't go anywhere. So as you walk through these infrastructure deserts, you'll see areas where there's brand new sidewalk, and then the next section, there's no sidewalk at all.
Right.
And then sidewalk that's all torn up. And none of that is any use to anybody, because you can't walk anywhere when you don't have a sidewalk that keeps going all the way. So
speaking of that, Dr.
other
Nick, I want to
cities,
ask you a question about that.
yeah.
Did you all look at any infrastructure policy to detail that in the report? So in Dallas, I've seen sidewalks. We call them sidewalks to nowhere, where it'll be a
Yeah.
sidewalk and then it'll end in a patch of grass, and then a few blocks later, it'll be a sidewalk again. So, did you all look
Yeah.
at infrastructure policy?
We haven't yet.
Okay.
It would be an interesting one because, I've lived in many different places across my life, and I've never been in a place where I've been told that you're in charge of the sidewalk in front of your
Right.
house.
Right.
It seems kind of crazy to me.
Mhm.
So, yes, we were in charge of shoveling snow in front of our house, but
Yeah.
not maintaining the sidewalk.
No, that's very interesting. I want to ask you about how, like what was the response from the city once they saw this infrastructure report? Partially, I think that they were lauding it as a way for, the local university SMU is doing some great work for the city, as if the report wasn't indicting the city itself, So I'm interested in what was the response from the city as they saw this report.
Yeah, well, I actually have a slide on that.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
if
let's
I
go. Yeah, let's go back
pop
to
down a
that.
little further here, I'll show it to you.
Okay.
Okay, so this is my slide on the limitations of the neighborhood boundaries. Don't really line up with what you might consider your neighborhood to be because it's based on census definitions. Also, I've talked a little bit about how we're defining substandard infrastructure, and we're weighting every kind of infrastructure evenly, and we're cutting off distances where we're saying if it's not within a 10-minute walk, it's not good enough. But if it were an 11-minute walk, it probably is good enough. So those are things that would be a limitation of the study, and then assuming that needs are the same in different neighborhoods. But here's the city of Dallas response.
Wow.
So when all these news first came out, I was actually tweeting with the mayor
Okay.
at the time, which I've never had that happen in my life, where he was asking me if we could help him on Twitter with overlaying these infrastructure deserts with some of the areas they've been looking at that are high crime, and trying to see if they can address some of the crime issues and the infrastructure issues together. So we've been working with the Child Poverty Action Lab on that overlay, which I passed to them, and they've been working with the mayor's office. I haven't heard too much about what happened with that. Janie Schultz, who's the chair of the Workforce Education and Equity Committee, reached out to me, and I had a meeting with her and a couple of the city staff. I've had a lot of meetings with the city staff. I counted them up. I had 6 meetings and a 3-hour workshop, which was April 15th. And there were about 30 people there. And I gave the presentation about the work. And then they asked every department to send a representative. And they all came except for Parks and Recreation that wasn't there.
That's
and
the
they
main
asked,
one.
Yeah, they went around the room and they asked each department to speak to what they were doing to address these issues.
Interesting.
Yeah, that really blew me away. Like, okay, they put them in the hot seat.
Right.
And I heard about a lot of things they were doing and also some frustrations. Like there was a person there who was from, what was it called? It was housing and redevelopment, or housing and development, something like that, housing department. And one of the things we had done a little study to look at the last bond issue in 2017. They get federal money to invest in redeveloping neighborhoods, but the federal money only allows them to spend the money on the footprint of the housing. So wherever they're putting the housing, they can spend federal money on that. But if they need to put infrastructure in to support that housing, they can't use federal money on it. So that puts them in a bind when they've got this good money rolling in and they don't have the money to get the infrastructure ready. So the same problem that the developers are having, the city is also having. And she said, what we really need is we need a bond just for housing. so that we can upgrade the infrastructure and do the housing together. So that was a very interesting perspective.
That is an interesting perspective.
There is a mandate across the city to integrate equity into all aspects of their capital investments as well as their operations. So they all say this, there's an equity plan, but they really, in many cases, don't know how to do this yet. So they're trying to figure it out. We had several meetings with the bond office. In particular, the bond issues have always been based on technical criteria, and then some shuffling around based on city councils. But pretty much, near as I can tell, they try to spend a similar amount in every council district. So now they got to figure out, well, if we're weighting it both by equity and by technical criteria. So if the pavement is bad, and there's so much more bad in this one area, how much should we focus all of our attention on that one area versus other areas that also still have issues? So there needs to be a weighting more heavily towards the one with worse problems. But what should that weighting actually be? That's what they're struggling with, is how to do that. So I'd say they're working hard to try and figure it out, but they don't have the answers yet.
Which means that poor infrastructure will remain for a while as they figure this out, and those priorities may shift as council shifts, right? So
yes. And
so you said mandate, which is a really interesting word for me because I work with the city a lot.
That was my word, so
yeah.
It might be too strong.
No. I think it's not strong enough because that's what happens.
Think probably a better word might be directive. They have a directive from the city council.
Because directive means that they should follow it, but they may not, and that's what we have seen as community members have worked on reports. There was a Resilient Dallas report that talked about some of this information. There's equity indicators, but the mandate to actually do the work has not really reached the budgeting concern. So I'm just really interested in how this will help them see what they need to do. As a last question, Dr. Minsker, I really appreciate you sharing this. And it's interesting that my questions have kind of led up to your slides too. What can a community do to support, the work that you've shown here and really help mandate the city to, build this infrastructure? And then the follow-up question to that is, there's been a federal infrastructure bill passed already. How will that impact any of this work?
That's right. So there's a federal infrastructure bill. I don't think it says anything about equity. So where's that infrastructure money going? There's a fair amount going to highways.
Yeah.
There's a fair amount going to airports. Those are sort of regional big infrastructure that serve a lot of people, but it's not neighborhood infrastructure. So I haven't seen the numbers of how that's going to break down to a neighborhood level and how much will go, into the city versus in other areas. I think that remains to be seen. The reality, though, is there's nothing that says about, what should we do about infrastructure in the future? It's just, let's go put some more infrastructure in and hope for the best, right? But not looking at people's needs at all. Well, we're going to come in and we're going to do X, right? Well, is that what the neighborhood wants or isn't it? So having those dialogues with the neighborhoods to say, what is it that you want to be? And what kind of infrastructure do you need to support that? That's the dialogues that are not happening at all. And that I think are really important, as, the residents have to be involved in saying what they want their neighborhood to be. And that future needs to include them, rather than as we fix up the infrastructure, suddenly it's gentrified and they can't afford to live there anymore. So how do we bring an affordable housing policy that allows people to stay in their homes? And this is what people have said to me. well, we can't fix the infrastructure problem because gentrification will happen and then people can't afford to live in their homes anymore. I said, so you mean because they're low income, they are forced to live with bad infrastructure? Because if we did anything about it, they wouldn't be able to afford to live there. I mean, that doesn't make
Right.
any sense. We got to be able to do something about this
That's
without,
that's the biggest argument for affordable housing. Folks say if we fix it up, they'll not be able to live there anymore, and that doesn't make sense
that's
to me,
right.
you know? So
Yeah. No, it's called policy.
yeah,
That's how we get around that problem. But we have to have strong policy. And I don't know that we have in this city or in
yeah,
Texas as a whole. It's a kind of free for all, do it yourself, bootstrap, figure it out. Don't ask government to have a lot of involvement.
so speaking of that, Texas, as it exists, is not really looking towards the future. And I think the infrastructure equity also lends an eye to things like climate change. And, you mentioned, one of the indicators is, the heat map when it comes to tree coverage,
Yeah.
So what are the future implications of this infrastructure equity report on Dallas specifically? I know, we were one of the hottest cities in the country. I saw that research a while ago. I just saw the noise map. We have this huge airport in the middle of our city, plus highways, plus all the other sound, from industry. What does the future for us look like when infrastructure is considered, particularly when we're talking about communities of color who don't have the infrastructure? Yeah.
To begin with. Yeah. So as the climate keeps warming up, the city's going to get hotter, and the areas that don't have tree coverage are going to get that much hotter. And so there will be more suffering when there's heat waves, more deaths with people who are, don't have air conditioning in their homes. There was an interesting study that was done of a heat wave in Chicago, and they found that they compared two neighborhoods, one where people had died from the heat, primarily elderly who couldn't get out of their apartments and didn't have any air conditioning, and a neighborhood that had the same situation, but people didn't die. And they found it was because there was more neighborhood cohesion in the ones where people didn't die. They knew their neighbors and they went and checked on them, and they pulled them out of their apartments if they were too hot. So that importance of having neighborhood community, which is another type of infrastructure we looked at, which is gathering places where neighbors can get to know each other. When we look at these kinds of disasters that come, whether it's pandemics or something else, those social ties to support people when they're going through difficult times are absolutely essential. And if people are isolated, whether it's because they don't know their neighbors, everybody's afraid to go out. So, or maybe they don't have a strong family support, all kinds of reasons that strike primarily low income and people of color more heavily than they do other people.
For sure.
So,
There's a documentary about that study. It's called Cooked: Survival by Zip Code. And the director, Judith Heflin, I actually sat down with her here in Dallas for EarthX to talk about that film.
Oh, wow.
Because I lived through that 1995 Chicago heat wave and saw, when those 700 people died in the course of a week, and 80% of them were poor, elderly, and African American.
Wow.
Yeah, so we also did an EarthX webinar about that. And one of the things, the hypothesis that she provides is that why we're not providing disaster support for things like, where we live by zip code, and we see some of these things happening now in Texas because of climate change, I think, and our terrible infrastructure when it comes to electricity, our
Yes.
terrible grid.
Yes.
Where
and we're having more extremes, so that's going to be hitting more and more. He saw the people that were lining up, not having water, not having power,
That's
you know,
right.
huddling in their cars if they had them. Those were primarily low income and people of color that were dealing with that. So
There's another
yeah.
instance too, and this is poor gas infrastructure. You know, Dallas, in the neighborhood I lived in, Bachman Lake, we had house explosions. One explosion actually killed a 12-year-old girl because
Yeah.
you know, Atmos was supposed to change poor gas infrastructure in Dallas, the whole city of Dallas. And this actually prompted Atmos to shut off the gas in my community, and folks were given. I mean, it was like a movie. Saw long lines of people who are waiting for Atmos to give them hotel vouchers because this is in the middle of winter where they shut off the
Wow.
gas and told folks that they had to work on this issue right now. So, you know, infrastructure is really, you know, I think it should be a priority. And thank you for this work. Any last words for us as we go on? Where can we find the report? Where can we find, you know, the work, and what are the future steps for your work? I know you talked about getting at the neighborhood level, but what are some other things you're going to do next?
Yeah. Well, I got a few more slides on that if you want to see
Okay,
them.
cool. Let's do that. Let's do that.
All right. Let me go back to those. Yeah, so next steps. The first thing is that our data are now 2 or more years old. So we got to update our data sets. And there are other kinds of infrastructure that we haven't looked at. And I've got a slide about that in a moment. When we're talking about getting down to the smaller scales, we're starting a partnership with City Lab High School this summer. And it's something called Research Experience for Teachers, where 2 teachers are going to come in and get involved in this project and get training in some of the data analyses that we're doing, and then teach their students in high school how to do this, and have the students go out and look at their own neighborhoods and what the infrastructure is and what is it that people need, so that it's actually the kids that are both learning about the data and learning about environmental justice and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, you know, preparation, so that they might be interested in pursuing STEM fields and go into college to learn more about those things, so they can get access to good jobs when they graduate. So it's kind of, it has dual benefits. So it's going to help the research, but it's also going to help these students to get out there. So we're having conversations with nonprofits about doing similar things with middle school kids and after school programs. And SMU has some programs that they're already doing with some of the neighborhood centers. So these are the different types of infrastructure that are not in the study right now. Housing is a huge one. And affordability is fairly easy to get data on, but housing quality is much harder. And that one we want to work on some more. Just got data on school condition. Somebody suggested looking at childcare facilities, which we hadn't thought of. Other kinds of access like cell phone and wireless, we hear that there's possibilities where we can look at those. And then a whole bunch of other types of civic infrastructure that we haven't looked at. A really important one has to do with the pipes and the water supply and the wastewater pipes. If they are too small or too old, then when developers come in to try and redevelop, say, to create better affordable housing, they have to replace the pipes, which is very expensive. And that data, they don't know about it. Even, you know, developers that are for profit and working in wealthy areas have told me, yeah, they've run into this problem, and they had a project all funded and then found out they have to replace the pipes, and it messed up the whole funding for the project. So those data are confidential, and we were able to get them for a couple neighborhoods and start to see some trends, but we couldn't get the whole city. So we got to work on that some more with the city. Other possibilities, we put in a proposal to the Dallas Foundation's call for proposals. And Drexel Osuwu contacted me, Owusu, contacted me and was asked us to apply to that, and was very interested in the idea of a dashboard that would show the status of the infrastructure and the changes over time. And so I think there's possibilities there for us to talk to the different groups that would be interested in this and figure out what needs to be on it, and then try to automate the updates to it.
Mhm.
And then looking at how the city should prioritize their investments, as well as anybody else who wants to invest in these things. Let's get some wealthy people investing in something useful like this,
Right. Instead of a
some
big
of the-
fountain in Clyde Warren Park for $10 million.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then also, one of my colleagues had the idea of, well, if we want to have tree canopy investments, why don't we connect that with the carbon credits program that's under discussion for the city? So I think that'd be an interesting possibility.
For sure.
And then the last thing I have is just our acknowledgements. And somewhere in here is your name, Jerry, right there. Thank you.
That's cool.
So that's all I have.
This is really cool. So how do you feel, in conclusion, seeing it manifest from Think Play Hack to now becoming a nationally recognized study?
Well, I don't know that it's nationally recognized yet, but it's
Well, I'm
certainly
talking about
regionally
press. I've seen it out
recognized.
I've seen it out of some press already. So
Yeah, I don't think I've seen it in any national sources yet, but it might yet happen, especially as we start looking at other cities
Yeah.
and the word starts getting out. I have heard from people who have Dallas connections. There was somebody in Florida who reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you do this in Florida cities?" I said, "Sure,
Right.
if you can get us the data. It's
And
easy
some
to
funding,
do."
right?
Yeah, it's not that hard to do it, even if we didn't have funding.
Mhm.
Just as long as somebody else corrals the data, we can show them how to do it. So it's the response has really bowled me over. This came out in February, was when the university released the press release, and the amount of intention, and I'm still getting invitations to speak rolling in, and it's been very gratifying to see that people care about this. I mean, I thought this is so banal, right? We're talking about sidewalks, and are people really going to care about this? And the fact that they get it is really exciting to me, that it's making a difference. And I hope that it will start to make a difference in more concrete ways to actually see improvements.
No, that's great. Dr. Minsker, I would definitely want to just thank you for spending some time with us and showing us some of the data and talking about the implications of race and ethnicity to this data. I hope that the city continues to look to you and the students for guidance on this work. Can really help us out. And I hope that you all get some more funding so you can do some of the, the future things that you all want to do with the data. We'll be, looking forward to sharing some of the work that you all are doing. Did you share where we can find this at?
Oh, yeah. I didn't get back to that question.
Okay.
So we have a story map that sort of tells the story in kind of laypersons, and I can send you that link for that story
Okay.
map. It doesn't have all the details of everything that I showed you today. There's my student's dissertation, which is very technical.
Yes.
And I don't have a whole lot in between. So I don't
Okay.
have a report just for anybody. If we get this funding from the Dallas Foundation, I said in it that we would create a report that would be
Nice.
for a more general audience. And probably, there's been a few articles that have talked about it, but it's pretty high level. So
Okay.
I think there's a need for something in between, but we haven't
There
done
is. There is. There is for sure. So
it.
let
Yeah.
us know if the Dallas Foundation doesn't do that. We'll figure something out.
Okay.
At least for the the layperson report, you know?
Yes, yes, that would be a need for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Well, awesome. Thank
but
you so
I
much.
will share the slides with you, and I'll give you the dissertation in case anybody wants to have it and more
Right.
else.
With the
And,
algorithms and stuff in it. That'll be
Yep,
interesting.
but it's also got the results. So,
Okay.
and the explanations for the results.
Sounds
And
great.
then the story map as well. I'll send you all that.
Well, that's awesome. Again, Dr. Minsky, I want to thank you. You know, from the beginning, you've been very inclusive in the approach to this work. So that's a credit to you and your staff and your students. So thank you again. And, you know, thank you for talking to us for Transformation Talks.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for your part in it. It
Of
was very
course.
helpful to hear from you, Jerry, at that time.
Of
And
course.
now as well. We've got 2 more years on the project. So
That's right.
ideas are good.
That's awesome.